Salutations, Rangers. The Horus Heresy had seemed some of the most deadliest fighting in all of the Imperium. It had shattered the notions of what the Emperor put forward, and what was once common truths were now found out to be more than little than low-born lies. Brother fought against brother, and those that were once the greatest of the great, the most elite, the Space Marines, began to die in droves unbefore imaginable. Thus, even they had to cut corners and they had to make do. And thus we have the Inductii. Yet what really were the Inductii? Were they mad and butchered berserkers? Were they less than what they were supposed to be? Were they just as good as normal legionaries? Did all legions truly hate them? And did they forever ruin the idea of the Space Marine? All that and more answered in today's Warhammer 40k lore video as we take a look at the Inductii of the Space Marines during the Horus Heresy. So, as per anything that deals with Space Marines, we find their origin way back during the Unification Wars, with the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors are the first official Imperial variant of gene-augmented super soldiers. They were flawed, but they were bloody brutal, and they were designed for one thing and one thing alone: retaking Terra. These guys were designed to be brutal instruments of pure meat-slabbed muscle and unfiltered hate. Any type of advanced tactics, thinking, or anything in between was not meant for them, nor were they expected to do it. Hence why their lifespans were notoriously short and incredibly volatile, both physically and mentally. But that's because they had to fight horrors that would leave even Space Marines lost for words. The Techno-Barbarians of old Earth were certainly fierce opponents, far more fierce than anything humanity is said to have faced in the Great Crusade. But it's important to note, they were never really like a true army in any stretch of the imagination. They were essentially a warband. They listened to the strongest amongst them and they operated as such. Think far less more of army and much more of warrior hunter tribes ready for war. Space Marines, however, they were different. The Space Marines were a true army in every single sense of the word. The Uncrowned Princes were the definition of a military force. Like, literally, they wrote the book on it. The Principia Bellicosa was a treatise that the Emperor wrote, which was heavily based on the experiences of the first ever Uncrowned Princes, and their interaction with the Thunder Warriors and the early stages of the Great Crusade. But it's also important to note that the Emperor also subtly pushed humanity into creating their own genetic super soldiers. It is believed in particular that the Emperor pushed the Selnar gene codes of Luna, basically giving them everything that they needed to make Astartes, except, the knowledge of what an Astartes was, or the recipe, so that when they were to conquer it, they could begin mass production. But for a little less successful task, we just need to simply look at the old tribes of Earth itself. Many of the Techno-Barbarians had some type of gene-augmented super soldier, but to call it a super soldier is, a very, 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 very big lie. They weren't really super and they certainly weren't soldiers. The name Techno-Barbarian is indeed as it sounds. They were barbaric in everything that they did, but with a level of technology and sophistication left over from Old Knight. These soldiers were much more akin to that of a Chaos mutation. Think something like a Chaos Spawn, or like a mutated possessed. An effective warrior, yeah, but a warrior, not really. Much more effective than warrior in any state of the imagination. So, when the Emperor made the Space Marines, he wanted to make something that was significantly better than the Thunder Warriors in terms of mental capacity and strategic thinking, but wasn't exactly as expensive as the Custodes. And lo and behold, we got the Space Marines. But like any military man knows, everything is all good and grand when at times of plenty, supply lines are guaranteed and there's no war on. But the minute somebody starts taking a look at your supply lines and thinking that they could use an extra helping of C4, well, necessity is the mother of all invention, as they say. And if we truly want to look at Inductii, we gotta go to the Horus Heresy. The first ever records of the rapid Inductii we can trace all the way back to the Wild Eaters. But more about them later. Eventually, at the outbreak of the heresy, every single legion would pick up Inductii of some way, shape, or form, because they needed to fill out losses, and they needed to fill out losses quick. What a lot of people don't understand is that a lot of the legions suffered massive casualties at the outset of the heresy. Heretic legions from either loyalist attacks in the case of the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves, or dying by their own hands, such as the Isavan III atrocity. And then of course we have the massacres conducted in secret in the opening stages. The Dropside Massacre being the most famous, and then of course the Betrayal at Calth. Basically, it's safe to say that every single legion was cut to at least half, some significantly more. But the fact of the matter is that everybody needed extra bodies. So everyone began making rapid Inductii. And generally speaking, Inductii would be given Mark V suits or Heresy suits, which is basically a mishmash and combination of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Mark of armors. However, it's noticed that rapid Inductii closer to better supply lines, such as the Imperial Fist and the Ultramarines, Mark VI was often given, as it was the most numerous and the most readily produced at the time. It's also plausible that Mark VII would be given unto those during the Siege of Terra, but that's not really stated anywhere, so, a little bit of grain of salt in that one. Basically, during the Horus Heresy, the attrition rates were diabolical, with many companies and chapters quickly falling below viable fighting strength. Thus, to combat the issue, every single legion had to rapidly recruit, implant, indoctrinate, and train brand new Space Marines. And again, like everything with the legions, this was done with varying degrees of success. and often varying wildly in terms of outcomes. These programs were poorly defined and often experimental, as again, this was not made by the Emperor. This was something that was literally pioneered by the World Eaters and everyone else picked up when going got tough. Whole apothecarions were put into the task of overcoming the challenge of shortening legion timescales, creating and implanting and tempering the legionary of the line. A process which might normally take years or decades had to be done in basically months. There's also these experiments, sometimes dubbed newborns by the veteran legionnaires, were undoubtedly space marines. They were. But they were often considered being apart from their former brethren created during the Unification or the Soul Wars. They really did vary in kind. From the Imperial Fist novitiates, who were simply inexperienced legionaries, to the rapidly created, highly motivated, but poorly trained Traitori of the Sons of Horus, who were the first into the breach. And then, of course, we have the original, but significantly more unstable, rapidly indoctrinated, highly dangerously surgical-altered, gene-enhanced inducti of the World Eaters, which arguably could have the award for being the less Space Marine-y in terms of being a Space Marine. But regardless, the effect of rapid genetic, psychological, and psychic conditioning were myriad and often disastrous. Yet, these warriors born of desperation were still relied upon by the Legiones Astartes. They were there to hold the line and swell the reserves, or to be the first part of a breach, preserving the lives of the more experienced and valuable warriors. But this varied. Some of these were treated as cannon fodder, others on the other hand were treated as valued warriors, with just a little less experience. But regardless if you were traitor or loyalist, both had inductii of all kinds. And it goes to show just how terrible the attrition rates during the Horus Heresy was. For during the final battle in the Siege of Terra, all forces would be counted as being understrength in some way, shape, or form, despite them incredibly relying upon rapid inducti to fill their ranks in the upcoming months to the siege itself. Because it did not matter how many men they recruited, a decade of relentless bloody war had bled even the mightiest of them white. And it would only get worse. We have several examples of inducti being used during the battles of the Horus Heresy. One of the most notable was the Siege of Cthonia. For when the command of the Imperial Fist who took over Cthonia, known as Garius, needed to reinforce his dwindling garrison, he began a rapid recruitment and conversion of the most suitable Chthonians into rapid inductii. He would constitute them into mass inducti companies to bolster his defenses and to supply Dawn with new troops for the heresy. This process would create a unique type of Space Marine, one whose temperament was very, very much different from that of the veterans of the Great Crusade. Whereas veterans of the Great Crusade were made to combat the horrors of Old Night, Xenos pirates, and those humans fallen from grace, these warriors were raised and trained to fight other Space Marines. They were disposable weapons of war, and nothing more. They had no grounding in the traditions of the Legion or reverence for the Primarch that had ordered their creation. They wore the colors of the Imperial Fist with indifference, not with pride. Thus did Commander Garius take deep pains to ensure that the old traditions of the Chthonian homeworld were significantly stripped away from them, with the worry that if they clung to them, they would have fallen into heresy, mainly because it was only the flash indoctrination that conditioned them to loyalty, rather than the years of war that had bound the original warriors of the 7th Legion to each other. Many of these inducti had their memories suppressed, or rather chose to suppress their own memories. But despite Cthonia being the homeworld of the War Master, there were many who were still indeed loyal to Terra. And at the end of it, during the occupation, the Imperial Fist was said to create approximately 5,000 inductii, combine them into mass inductii companies. Again, the fact of the matter that these always were able to make 5,000 in that short span of time is madness. We're talking weeks to months, when normally creating a Space Marine was measured in years. It's also noted that the Sons of Horus would use inducti of their own, but during the Siege of Cthonia, the mass ranks of the inducti companies of the Sons of Horus would be tested finally. Again, they were highly motivated, and they were given good arms and armor, but they were poorly trained. The methodology behind it being that, hey, you got a good sword, you got a good head, you may not know how to swing it, but just keep on bludgeoning the bastard until he dies. What's important to note is the distinction between inductii. One thing to know is that the term inducti, generally speaking, refers to all Space Marines created post-heresy. But it's unknown if every single Space Marine ever created was an inductii, i.e., the idea of creating an original legionary from the old process was just upright abandoned. It's very much possible that it could be, but I imagine it'd be much more a simpler case of saying that for the majority of them it was. I can imagine that if you wanted your elite formations to be replenished, you would take the time and the painstaking requirements needed to make them the old-fashioned way. Think about elite Terminator formations, elite Breacher formations, elite Jump Troop formations, or anything whatever they were known for. Now yes, all the pomp, flair, and ceremony that normally accompanied them would have vanished, but you still would have wanted that unique type of training that went with it. But for a standard line legionary to hold the company line, well, just give them the good old slap bang dish dash and throw them on. Also, to truly understand how important and why so many people thought inductii were decisive, you really need to understand what it was to create a Space Marine. You see, each legionary was fashioned from the base of just mortals. They were taken and they were made into a superhuman warrior that few could ever match. and the process was threefold. It required a lengthy process of surgical augmentation, genetic manipulation, and psych conditioning. The development of such intricate labor required the minds of peerless intellect, and by their hands was fashioned a several-year-long process that balanced the risk of aspirant tissue degradation, organ rejection, and candidate fatalities against the personal demands of an unceasing war. The training and the implantation were folded together. The mind and body of the aspirant were transformed concurrently, so that at the end of the conclusion, the process of a true legionary had been forged, one that was ready and eager to conquer. To create a Space Marine legionary during the Horus Heresy, it took literal years, and you couldn't make them anywhere. You needed specifically crafted unique units. For you see, whilst in the modern day 40k it's up to the apothecarian and maybe the chaplaincy to make a new Space Marine, back then, you had massive wings dedicated to it. You had specialists from the lunar gene cults, you had specialists from the Emperor himself. There was so much more oversight and standardization. You had to do so much to make a Space Marine. Even those who shunned most of these things, a la the World Eaters and the Night Lords, still took years to make a proper Space Marine. And in legions where they valued such things, such as the Ultramarines and the Emperor's Children, the process was even more harsh. So believe it or not, creating a Space Marine back in the Legion was significantly longer and harder than creating a Space Marine in modern day 40k. But the limits of that process had been tested like never before during the Horus Heresy. Now, whilst the Great Crusade was certainly not a walk in the park, and it was goddamn dangerous to do, it was rare that the operational capacity of a legion was threatened by casualties, and rarer even still that such losses were recorded upon the field of battle. Again, gotta keep up appearance. Big E is not a master propaganda. The most infamous of such conflicts, the Third Rangdan Xenocide, was said to have claimed the lives of tens of thousands of legionaries, and is what finally dropped the Dark Angels from being the #1 in terms of the numbers game. Yet, despite this, it did little to hamper their ability to prosecute the war, and they were able to recruit their numbers steadily over the years. This, however, would be thrown completely and utterly out of whack by the war unleashed by Horus Lupercal, for in his effort to conquer Terra, he would ignite a war unlike anything the Imperium had ever faced. Brother fought against brother, and the Imperium was riven by mistrust and betrayal. Legionary societies were on the forefront, and all of a sudden what had become the venerable conquerors became little more than cannon fodder. Slaughter came after slaughter, time and time again, and what was once inconceivable, the Adeptus Astartes being slain by the thousands on a daily basis, became normal. Yet as the legionaries fell in their droves, the War Master would have no delay in his march, leading casualties to outstrip new recruits. In the face of such destruction, each legion would be confronted with a terrible dilemma: remain dedicated to the existing standards of indoctrination and risk sacrifice upon the altar of war, their traditions being their ultimate death, or turn over to newer methods to replenish their numbers, no matter the costs, at the risk of giving up their soul. And in the end, numbers are always telling. As I mentioned before, the term inducti is a broad application to basically any legionary recruited past the events of Istavan V and the beginning of the heresy in earnest. However, it is known that the origin of the word actually lies with the world of Bot. Bot was one of the main fief planets of the World Eaters Legion, and said to be their main recruiting ground. Imagine it kind of like the Armatura of the Ultramarines. However, here, the World Eaters would spit out blood-crazed monsters clad in the flesh of a Space Marine, each one of them a nightmarish mockery of the ideals of the Legiones Astartes. Poorly armed, poorly trained, poorly equipped, yet full of bloodthirsty rage and savagery, these creatures were labeled inducti by their creators, and this would be a term that would be disseminated amongst the traitor legions to refer to all new legionaries recruited into a legion. However, most tellingly, it was often a byword for shame. It was often spoken with utter disdain from the veteran legionaries who believed these new breeds, or newborns as they called them, to be of poor stock and utterly useless. Traitor inducti were often distinguishable by their signs too, such as amongst the Emperor's Children, the inducti were forbidden to wear the Palatine Aquila, whilst among the Sons of Horus, a handful of veterans decried the usage of Chthonian symbols with those not from Cthonia, and thusly if they found you doing something like, say, the Eye of Horus, well, you'd be assumably beat, possibly unto death. But here another distinction must be made. It is said that the traitor legions made the greatest use of inducti, but more than that, they had the harshest reputation. Amongst traitors, it's widely considered that they made the most, but more importantly, it's the traitors that felt hatred for these guys specifically. It is believed that the wounded pride of these legionaries caused them to view these new troopers with disdain. Something along the lines of them thinking, we can get this done without you. We don't need you. You are not one of us. You are false. And this would be congruent with the standard thought process of traitor legionaries at the time. Traitor legionaries, when composed of loyalists, are far more worried about their pride and their honor, possibly due to the psychological backlash of having betrayed the Emperor and having that put into question. Another thing that supports this is that the term inducti is largely absent from the records of loyalist legions. Yet, many of them have a word that is similar to inducti, But most importantly and most telling, it carries none of the negative stigma nor bitter emotion attached to it. They were simply just newly recruited legionaries that were different from their veteran brothers. Basically, in the loyalist legions, the term inductii didn't really exist, but every legion had a word similar for it. But unlike the traitor legions, it did not mean to refer to something as negative. It simply just meant new, inexperienced recruit. Whereas those who existed before all this were simply referred to as veteran legionaries. For example, the Imperial Fist would refer to their new recruits as sentries or neophytes, while amongst those garrisoned on Inwent or in present or other strike forces, recruits or initiates were often used as a term. Other legionaries were noted for expressing more outward disdain to their inductii. And again, we have a rare case of the loyalists being the Space Wolves. The Wolf King is said to have stated to his assembled Wolf Lords, "To trust not the pups whose claws have not yet to be bloodied, bearing claws that have never rent flesh, and not sharpened upon the hide of a foe." But it's important to note, this is again different from the traitors. Ross here is basically saying like, hey, don't send them to do the hard shit. You can't really trust them to do that. Whereas with the traitors, it was much more a case of, we hate you, why are you here? Again, they're much more treated like new recruits, rather than anything negative. It's also noted that this process changed rapidly from legion to legion. And the results also changed as well. But the Mechanicus would then look into this, and they would realize that there was much little in terms of physiological difference. Basically, these guys were still physically a space marine. The difference really came with arms, armor, equipment, and training, but more specifically, mentality. Another thing to make note is that more often than not, these inductii were not seen as true legionaries because, well, they skipped a lot of the extra bits. At the end of the day, these guys were meant to be soldiers first and foremost. But during the days of the legions, they were seen as warriors. Each legion had a unique warrior culture. The Salamanders are the most prominent in this, because they have the Promethean Creed, a secular creed which again heavily impacted the legion. Inductii, however, would not be given the full rundown of everything. They'd be taught the bare bones and be sent to the front. This, by inherence, meant that while they were physically basically the same thing, in terms of how they acted, they were completely different. These legionaries, even the most earliest at the time of the Dropside Massacre, for example, would still be years of veterancy ahead of these inductii, because they had spent years learning their legion, embracing their legion, loving the legion and the culture around it. In addition, the recruitment crowns that many legionaries had used for the entirety of the Great Crusade were often compromised now, or the legion itself could not get to them. Prime example being the Shattered Legions. The Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders were completely cooked when it came to anything normal. Thus, they had to change and become abnormal. To much of the veteran legionaries, these were not legionaries. They were not warriors, because they didn't have the culture around them. Because to them, what made a legionary was not simply just the fact that you were a space marine. It was the culture around it, the veneration of the Primarch in the Great Crusade. But some would further make an argument that that could never happen again. For the illusion of the Primarchs in the Great Crusade had been shattered with the betrayal of Horus. Thus, there could never be another true legionary. But then we're getting more into the concept of metaphysical and emotional and psychological nonsense rather than the actual physical capabilities. But some would argue those are what truly separate. Because if the Mechanicus are to be believed, physically, an inductor and a veteran were basically the same. What separated them would be the years of training and emotion behind the actions. But that's basically the broad definition. The broad strokes of what makes an inducti an inducti. But now for a bit more of a detailed example, we're going to go through each and every single legionary. Luckily for us, each legionary template is outlined lovely in the Horus Heresy books. So I'm going to read through each one of them now and give you the direct definition straight from the horse's mouth of what you can expect from inductii of each legion. The Dark Angels. Recruited in the wake of the Crusade of Vengeance and equipped with deadly weaponry from the darkest vaults of the First Legion, the inductii of the Dark Angels are the Lion's weapons against the traitors. Though not party to the secrets of the Hexagrammaton, these recruits nevertheless provided the Dark Angels with resources needed to prosecute their crusade across a wide front. The Emperor's Children. As the fruits of Chief Apothecary Fabius Bile's work spread throughout the Legion, more and more new recruits were the subject of experimentation by the Legion's Apothecarion. Empowered by a potent cocktail of experimental combat stimulus and physical modifications, their tortured minds strove for ever more destructive words and a desire for perfection. Perfection embodied the inductii of the Emperor's Children, and thus they fought in a state of bliss that saw them fight on despite casualties. Only when they failed to completely annihilate their enemies was their resolve seemed to waver, however briefly. The Iron Warriors. Utterly indoctrinated into their unyielding master's methods of waging war, the inductii of the Iron Warriors were likened unto the automata of the Cybernetica cohorts. Many observers compared them to statues, lurching into life to destroy their foe with roaring bolters before returning to unmoving silence. The inductii of the Iron Warriors were conditioned to place no value on their own lives, marching stoically towards the foe, facing devastating wave of foes in turn, with bolter and blade. It is also noted that in the Devastation of Talon, we see that the Iron Warriors directly hook inductii into tanks to keep them fighting at all times. It's sort of a pseudo-dreadnought, but significantly more crude, significantly more deadlier to everyone involved, and with significantly less fanfare. It's also unknown that if the Iron Warriors introduced any type of lobotomy into the Inductii, but given how they're described, it's quite possible, or they just had very harsh psycho-indoctrinations. The White Scars. Recruited during the latter years of the Civil War, many of the inductee of the White Scars were noticeably more pragmatic than their brethren, often receiving training from the Imperial Fists and Blood Angels, alongside the recruitment masters of their own legion. These warriors were often utilized as scouts by the contingents they fought alongside, before joining their legion proper. Thus, to prove their valor, the inductee of the White Scars often sought to prove their worth to the legion through feats of arms, testing their skill against their foes' elite warriors, in order to win the approval of their more experienced brethren. The Space Wolves. The inductee of the Space Wolves retain many of their tribal traditions, each seeking to prove their skill with blade and shield. With little time for training or indoctrination, these warriors were physically augmented, and then thrust into the crucible of battle, there to be forged into true legionnaires. Headstrong, the inductee of the Space Wolves were prone to bravado, each warrior trying to outpace their fellows across blades with their enemy. While effective as shock tactics, such charges lacked the cohesive impact that more disciplined units were able to bring to bear. The Imperial Fists. As mankind's civil war ground on, it became increasingly clear that the conflict would ultimately be decided upon terror. With this in mind, Rogodern turned his legion towards creating a defensive focus. Each new warrior was to be another brick in the defensive bastion of terror, holding their designated position until slain. Such warriors were effective, if lacking initiative, a necessary evil in those dark days. The Imperial Fist's creative resilience permeated the mindset of the Inductii. Such warriors refused to give up even the most insignificant portion in the face of their foe, pinning the enemy in place, allowing supporting artillery to obliterate them at a distance. It is also known during this time that the Betches gland was purposely removed from the implementation sequence of the Imperial Fists, and subsequently was never added again, hence why they are missing that gene seed. Night Lords. The scattered bands of Night Lords weaved throughout the Imperium, each warlord recruiting the most vicious killers they could find, and demanding their obedience. Such inductii were undoubtedly skilled killers, though the psychological makeup would have horrified the recruitment masters of more disciplined legions. Unscrupulous murderers as they were, the inductii of the Night Lords employed every underhand trick imaginable to kill their foes, feigning honorable intent to distract a more powerful foe, before ensuring they were laid low with a murderous blade in their back. The Blood Angels. The inductii of the Blood Angels saw none of the beauty in battle that their Legion brothers spoke of, knowing only the horror of galactic civil war, shorn of the intensive hyper-indoctrination that curbed the more animalistic aspects imbued by their gene seed. These warriors were often the dark mirror to their angelic brethren. The Revenant Legion inductii of the Ninth Legion embodied the darker side of their Legion's psyche, often stopping mid-battle to tear slain foes apart and consume their flesh. The Iron Hands. The use of cybernetic enhancements by the Iron Hands ensured that the flow of new recruits was kept high even when biological resources were running short, or when implantation of other organs failed. Following the death of Ferrus Manus and the loss of Zistavan V, these warriors would also come to see the forbidden technologies employed by their Legion commonplace, the desire to punish the traitors, overwhelming any concerns about provenance. Many inductii were thus issued with augmentations derived from technology said to be sealed away from Ferrus Manus. Was undoubtedly effective, they were also somewhat erratic, to the point of being dangerous, though to the nihilistic Iron Hands, these risks were considered acceptable. And more often than not, when the inductii were slain, they would often be resurrected again as foul revenants, via the machinations of the disastrous Dark Age of technology, known as the Keys of Hell. The World Eaters. The inductii of the World Eaters lived short and typically brutal lives, thrown to battle with little regard for preservation of forces or missing attrition. Implanted with the butcher's nails at a young age, their tormented minds inhabited vat-grown bodies, resulting in even more unstable but undoubtedly ferocious killers, devoid of any sense, pain, fear, or defeat. Often poorly armed and equipped and barely trained, their natural bloodlust in which the Legion bred them would serve as all the tools they needed. The Ultramarines. Throughout the Heresy, Rabute Gilliman made numerous tactical adjustments to his Legion, adapting it more subtly for the effective prosecution of that conflict. Newly inducted warriors would be trained to fight in more flexible formations, suitable to engagement that would be typical of the Horus Heresy. Their belief in their cause was unshakable. The Death Guard. The inductii of the Death Guard spent much of their training being separated from the bulk of their Legion, sent forth from smaller holdings and from Barbarous itself to fortify, endure, and if possible, expand their numbers. These warriors spread throughout the galaxy like a pestilence. Many foes were destroyed upon stumbling across their hidden garrisons, unaware of the threat before it consumed them. These inductii were indoctrinated and trained to be resilient in the face of anything that the enemy could throw at them. The more of their brethren that were laid low, the more determined the survivors became to outlast their foes. The Thousand Sons. In the aftermath of the destruction of Prospero, the Thousand Sons were forced to be less discerning in their recruitment, experimenting with forbidden bioalchemy and psychic indoctrination techniques in an attempt to rapidly rebuild their scattered legion. The resulting inductii were undoubtedly potent warriors and sorcerers, but exhibited a greater susceptibility to the flesh change. The prosecution of the Horus Heresy left little time for extensive introduction in any but the most basic arcana. Etheric guidance was one of the most simplest arcanas, and thus this allowed the practitioner to form a bond between mind and weapon, ensuring that each shot fired found weakness in their foe's armor. The Sons of Horus. The Sons of Horus were reasonably indiscriminate in their recruiting practices, operating as they did at the forefront of the Civil War. The most successful inducti, however, were taken from worlds whose gang traditions mirrored those of Cthonia, ensuring the new legionaries already understood the culture and the strength required to prove their worth in the eyes of their superiors. Inducted into the War Master's own legion, the inducti of the Sons of Horus sought to prove their worth to the superiors. In a legion which brutality, resilience, and sheer strength begun to be seen as the only true virtues, with all others being known as weakness. The Wordbearers. As the Civil War progressed, the Wordbearers' mastery of profane lore became a core part of their strategies, unleashing the powers of the Imperium upon their unsuspecting foes. Marked with diabolical runes and brands, the Inductii were routinely exposed to the energies of the warp, hardening their souls and preparing their bodies for the eventual binding of malevolent warp entities. They were known as empty vessels, and they embraced it. For the Inductii of the Wordbearers strove to attract the eye of newfound gods through their actions, their richly marked bodies a beacon to the denizens of the warp. The Salamanders. Following the events of Isstvan V, the scattered remnants of the Salamanders took to recruiting from worlds liberated from traitor oppression. These Inductii were often granted war gear taken from slain warriors of the Legion, accepting both the honor that this bestowed and the expectation that it brought. Banded together under Legion veterans, these new units fought even harder to earn their place. Because of the nature of the Salamanders, with each warrior handcrafting his own gear, making it incredibly high quality, and with now the process of the dead man's gear being transitioned to the younger generations, the Salamanders were one of the few legions in which the Inductii were just as well armed and armored as the veteran legionnaires of old, and were also some of the most well-trained, as they were often conjoined with other veteran legionaries to teach them, rather in other cases where they were combined to their own mass Inductii companies. For it was said that the veterans placed the trust and future of the Legion in the hands of each new recruit. The Raven Guard. The history of the Raven Guard's recruitment in the wake of Isstvan V is shrouded in mystery, but it is clear that the Legion recruited from many worlds left in the wake of the Lion's Crusade of Vengeance, taking the downtrodden and offering them a chance to strike back at their previous oppressors. The Raven Guard had molded a new generation of warriors in the image of those they had lost. Thus, the Inductii of the Raven Guard perpetuated the Legion's credo of never remaining stationary, extracting themselves from danger to strike anew and from a different angle. This would lead to lower casualties amongst the Raven Guard Inductii. It is also known that Corvus Corax at this time would create the Raptor program, an attempt to maintain the original potency of the Great Crusade era legionary, yet at the same time accelerating the process to meet the demands of the new crusade. And whilst he would see initial success, his work would be poisoned by Chaos agents, forever removing the knowledge of the Raven Lord. The Alpha Legion. Thorough examination of the 20th Legion activity of the Horus Heresy had led to some to speculate that the Alpha Legion had been performing mass indoctrination of recruits since their very inception, using what other legions would call inductii as the mainstay bulk of their legion, utilized in holding positions while their more experienced brethren would encircle the enemy. These warriors were employed in less clandestine roles that was typical of the 20th Legion's operations. Though relatively inexperienced, the inductii of the Alpha Legion was still adept at mimicking the signals of their foes, and thus would be the bait to lure them in before the rest of the Legion would open fire and destroy them. But that's what the Legions thought of themselves. But now let's take a look at what someone else other than a Space Marine thought of these inductii. Yet, it was within the bastions of the 4th Legion that I was most disquieted. Though I had seen the oceans thick with blood, witnessed nature defined by creatures far beyond reality, it was in such forgotten redoubts that I was shaken. On the fringes of civilization, we tore down a string of fortresses, and on each occasion we were met not with attempts at discourse or taunts, so readily offered by others of such traitorous ilk, but with the voiceless ranks of warriors bedecked in silver, motionless, still in battle, ruthless in their slaughter. Only when a fortress was conquered did we catch glimpses of the truth, of boot prints impressed into the metallic from years of station, of armor unprotected and scarred by the passage of time, of pit caps displaying unmoving warriors given life only by trespassers, returned to slumber by the destruction. Each garrison was akin to automata, rousing only for battle, then returning to their positions once more, with gaps left in their ranks where the fallen had once stood. Wardens they were, but lacking in a desire to preserve, possessed only of a true passionate desires to stand until threatened, and then fight until they could stand no more. As a child, I dreamt of the Emperor's Astartes, of ascending to the stars as one of his angels. Years of bitter war has swept away such notions, yet a shred of idealism must still have lingered, for the creatures perturbable suns had wrought, unleashed darkness upon my soul. In skin and sinew, the guardians we faced were legionaries Astartes, but far less in mind and in spirit. However, hollow they were, a sham of majesty, a facsimile of life created to propagate spite and death, to stand amongst rubble and ruin. Personal recollections of Anastasius the Rels, Legate Marshal of the 2903rd Solar Auxiliar Cohort, the Star Conquerors, during the liberation of the ravaged systems of the Sokrath sector. With that, let's sum up the Inductii. The Inductii are still Space Marines, by every stretch of the imagination, but the question lies in what type of Space Marines were they? The fact of the matter is that every single Space Marine, even in those legions that treated them very well, such as the Ultramarines and Salamanders, were not the same as the legionaries of old. They were less, regardless of how small it may have been, because at the end of the day, you cannot replace years of training and even countless more decades of honorable service. They were Space Marines, but they were not the same Space Marines. They were less in quality, but more in number. Such was the trade. But ultimately, the legacy of the Inductii can be summed up as follows. The Inductii were not the last of the legions, but they were the first of the chapters. For many of the gene seed flaws that are common in Space Marine chapters, such as the loss of the Betcher's gland in the Imperial Fists as well as the Raven Guard, and the trading practices of the Space Wolves, in that their recruits are often put into Blood Claws, which are shock assault units, stem all the way from the Inductii, and those hard choices needed to be made way back when. For what was supposed to be just a temporary measure to fill out ranks for the final assault would eventually become hallowed doctrine, carried on for tens of thousands of years. Another thing to make note of Inductii, the gene seed was permanently changed. The gene seed of modern day 40k has been degraded so incredibly hard compared to that of the Great Crusade, and that can be traced all the way back to the Inductii, when the Apothecarion was forced to meddle with what the Emperor had deemed good, for the sake of military power. The legacy of the Inductii is very much so like the legacy of Warhammer and the Imperium. What was supposed to be the best of the best, to hallow in and usher a new age, eventually became something but a weak mirror image. A lesson that in the grim darkness of the far future, everyone is less than what they were. But with the progressing of the setting, many old powers are being revivified, and with the introduction of the Primaris Marine, one must wonder where they stand in the grand scheme of all of this. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Let me know down below what you guys think. What do you guys think about the Inductii? Necessary evil? Do you think they ruined the Legion? And what do you think about us trying to go back to that time? Would love to hear your thoughts down below. I want to say a massive thank you to you guys for watching. A massive thank you to my awesome members and patrons. Shout out to brand new member, Mr. Weaselback, who joined at the private tier. Welcome, my chap, and thank you so much for joining on. A massive shout out to my officer corps with my amazing lieutenant tier members, Mr. Eddie V3 and Miss Majora of the Void. Shout out to my sergeant tier members, Mr. Damiak, Mr. Andy McGee, Mr. Warsmith.Fireheart, Mr. Corns Butcher, Mr. Sean RL7, Mr. Bullwin, and Mr. Matthew Merrill. Shout out to my corporal tier members, Tremail the Math Kitty, Lord Rosarius, Shauna Smithers, Tech Priest Toaster, and the Winch of Warhammer. And finally, but certainly not least, shout out to my private tier members, Mr. Thomas Waslawns, Mr. Niva_SPW, Mr. Michael Hayeda, Mr. Doris Kurz, Mr. Monkey Man, Mr. Diego Castro, Mr. Fortusunum, Mr. Gentle Salamander, Mr. CMD Neo, Mr. Simon Kamu, and Mr. Dan Marek. Thank you, all of you. I love you and appreciate you. Sign up there with the memberships again, early access videos, brand new stuff, and soon we're going to be having member-only exclusive content coming up. That's going to be coming very soon, so look out for that. But remember, whether I give your boy $1 or not, I will love you just the same. Mwah! Best way to help out this channel is to like, comment, share, subscribe, do all those wonderful things down below. And I want to say a massive thank you guys for watching. But ladies and gentlemen, I've been the General Belly 101. You've been beautiful, awesome, amazing people. Thank you all so very much for watching. Y'all make sure to stay loyal to boys and gals. And I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss, Rangers. Bruh, Horus done fucked up so bad he made Timu Space Marines. Lamau.